It is 1944. A German sniper lies prone in the ruins of a farmhouse in Normandy. He is a veteran of the Eastern Front. He has survived the frozen hell of Stalingrad. He has traded shots with the best Soviet marksman the Red Army could throw at him. He feels confident. He knows how to hide. He knows how to wait. But here, in the hedgerows of France, something is different. On the Russian front, the danger was a tidal wave, mass artillery, freezing cold, and thousands of enemy riflemen. It was chaotic. But here, the silence is heavier. He scans the tree line. Nothing moves. He shifts his weight just an inch to relieve a cramp. Suddenly, without hearing a shot, the brickwork 6 inches from his head explodes into dust. He freezes. He hasn't been spotted by a patrol. He hasn't been suppressed by a machine gun. He is being hunted. For the German sniper, the Eastern Front was a brawl. The Western Front against the British was a chess match where the loser died. While history books often focus on the legendary duels of Stalingrad, many German veterans held a unique, chilling respect and deep fear for the British counter-sniper teams. They were patient, they were scientifically precise, and they were invisible. Welcome to the last offensive. Today, we uncover the untold psychological terror of the British sniper teams and why the Wehrmacht learned to fear the silent stalkers of the West even more than the mass sharpshooters of the East. To truly understand the specific, cold sweat fear that German snipers felt in Normandy, we first have to step back into the blood-soaked mud they had just escaped. Most of the German snipers deployed to face the British in 1944 were not fresh recruits. They were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, survivors of a war of annihilation that defied human comprehension. In the East, the war was elemental. It was a clash of millions. The Soviet doctrine regarding snipers reflected this philosophy of total war. It was about mass, volume, and overwhelming force. The Red Army didn't just train snipers. They industrialized them. They established massive training schools that churn out thousands of marksmen and markswomen, deploying them not as solitary ghosts, but as battalions of disruptors. Facing Soviet snipers was terrifying, but for the German soldier, it was often a known quantity. The Russians were aggressive, sometimes recklessly so. They worked in pairs or squads, often moving directly alongside the main infantry force during massive assaults. The sheer number of Soviet snipers meant that the air was constantly filled with lead. If you were a German soldier in Russia, you knew the rules. If you stuck your head up, a bullet might find you. It was a constant, chaotic hazard environment, no different than the biting frost, the knee-deep mud, or the screaming Katyusha rockets. It was a fear of probability. If enough bullets are in the air, one will eventually hit you. However, the German snipers often maintained a sense of technical and tactical superiority in the East. In the early years of Operation Barbarossa, the German Sharpshooters regarded themselves as the elite hunters of the battlefield. They were equipped with superior Kar 98K rifles fitted with high-quality Zeiss optics, glass that was clearer and more durable than the early Soviet scopes. They looked across the steppes and saw the Soviet mass attacks not just as a threat, but as a target-rich environment. To a skilled German veteran, the Eastern Front was a shooting gallery. He could lie in a ruined factory in Stalingrad or a trench in Kursk and rack up dozens of kills simply because the enemy presented so many targets. The dynamic was clear. The Soviet sniper was a hammer, trying to smash the German line through brute force and attrition. The German sniper was a shield, holding back the tide. They feared the Russians, yes, but they did not respect their subtlety. But then came 1944. These veterans were transferred to the Western Front to bolster the Atlantic Wall. They arrived in France and the Low Countries, expecting what they called a gentleman's war. They expected the British and Canadians to be softer than the Russians. They were dead wrong. When the shooting started in the hedgerows of Normandy, the game changed entirely. The German veterans realized with dawning horror that the British didn't use snipers as mass infantry support. They didn't use them to suppress wide areas. The British used snipers as surgical instruments. The British Army had taken a completely different approach to marksmanship. They didn't just teach men how to shoot a rifle. They taught them how to vanish. Influenced heavily by the Scottish Lovat Scouts and the traditional skills of the Highlands, the British doctrine was built on the art of the stalk. The Germans realized quickly that in the dense bocage of France, they weren't fighting a conscript army relying on human waves. They were fighting gamekeepers, deer stalkers, and professional hunters. These were men who had spent their civilian lives tracking stags across the Scottish Highlands or poaching game in the English countryside. They treated the war not as a battle, but as a hunt. In Russia, a sniper duel was often a rapid exchange of fire. Whoever saw the muzzle flash first won. In the West, it was a test of agonizing patience. A British sniper team would not fire at the first helmet they saw. They would wait. They would watch a German position for hours, sometimes an entire day, tracking routines of the German officers and, crucially, the German snipers. For the Wehrmacht veteran, this was a psychological shock. In the East, he was a hunter picking off poorly trained conscripts. In the West, he was the prey. He found that his enemy possessed a level of fieldcraft that rivaled his own. The British sniper knew how to read the wind through the trees, how to use the shadows of the hedgerows to mask his approach, and how to remain so perfectly still that birds would land on his barrel. The German sniper in Russia feared the noise and the chaos. The German sniper in France learned to fear the silence. He learned that while the Soviet sniper might miss him 3 times before hitting him, the British sniper would likely only fire once, and he would never hear the shot that killed him. This was a shift from industrial warfare to personal, intimate stalking, and for men of the Wehrmacht, it was terrifyingly effective. The root of the German sniper's paralyzing fear lay in the specialized, almost archaic nature of British training. While other nations rushed to modernize warfare with tanks and rockets, the British Army looked backward to a lesson learned in blood half a century prior. They established specific sniper schools in the UK and later in France, the curriculum of which was heavily influenced by the legendary Lovat Scouts, a Scottish regiment with a history dating back to the Boer War. To understand why this mattered in 1944, you have to understand who these men were. The Lovat Scouts were unique among Allied forces. They were not recruited from the slums of London or the factories of Birmingham. They were recruited from the mist-shrouded highlands of Scotland. These were men who had spent their entire lives stalking red deer in some of the most rugged, unforgiving terrain on Earth. They brought a skill set to the war that simply could not be taught in a 6-week boot camp. You can teach a raw recruit how to load a rifle, how to clean it, and how to hit a target at 300 yards. But you cannot teach him instinct. You cannot teach a city boy how to sense a shift in the wind before it happens, or how to move across a floor of dry leaves without making a sound. The Highlanders already knew this. They knew how to use the terrain not just for cover, but as a weapon. They knew how to crawl on their bellies through freezing mud for hours, inch by agonizing inch, to get the perfect angle. This philosophy was physically embodied in their equipment, the Ghillie Suit. Today, the Ghillie Suit is a staple of video games and action movies, but in World War II, it was a revolution in personal camouflage. The term ghillie comes from the Scottish Gaelic for a lad or a gamekeeper's assistant. These were the men who helped aristocrats hunt deer. To get close to a skittish stag, the ghillie had to become part of the landscape. The British took this concept to the battlefield. The suit wasn't just a uniform. It was a wearable ecosystem. It consisted of a base of hessian or burlap strips, but the sniper was expected to modify it constantly with local vegetation. A British sniper didn't just wear green. He wore the specific ferns, grass, and mud of the field he was hiding in. While German camouflage smocks were advanced patterns printed on cloth, the British mastered the art of breaking the human silhouette entirely. To the naked eye, they were nothing more than a mound of moss or a thicket of brush. For a German sniper peering through a Zeisscope, this was a nightmare scenario. In Russia, the threats were visible. He might spot a Soviet sniper by the glint of a poorly shaded scope, the darker shape of a helmet against the snow, or a muzzle flash from a broken window. There were visual cues. But facing the British Lovat trained teams, the German sniper often never saw his killer. He was fighting a phantom. The British counter-sniper teams were trained specifically for the task of hunting other snipers. This was their primary directive. Their patience was weaponized. A German sniper, trained in the fast-paced warfare of the East, might fire a shot and then wait 15 minutes before moving. He would think that was enough. But the British team would be watching. They wouldn't scan the area frantically. They would observe it with scientific detachment. They would observe a German position not for minutes, but for an entire day. They employed high-powered spotting scopes, far superior to standard binoculars, to dissect the landscape yard by yard. They looked for the absence of nature. They knew that nature has a rhythm. If a bird suddenly stopped singing in a specific tree, a human was there. If a patch of tall grass swayed against the direction of the wind, a human was crawling there. If there was a slight, almost invisible shimmer of heat rising from a bush, it wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a heat rising from a warm rifle barrel. When a German sniper engaged a British unit, he wasn't just dodging return fire from panicked infantry. He was unwittingly triggering a dedicated, highly trained two-man team, a shooter and a spotter, whose only job was to locate him. The spotter would track the supersonic crack of the bullet to triangulate the position, and the shooter, wrapped in his ghillie suit, would calculate the windage. They were methodical, they were invisible, and they were deadly quiet. They didn't fight the war. They hunted the enemy. The fear the Germans felt in Normandy went beyond the physical danger of bullets and shrapnel. It was deeply corrosive and psychological. To understand it, you have to look at the nature of the threat. Fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviets was like walking through a violent thunderstorm. It was loud, chaotic, and if you were hit, it felt like bad luck amidst a catastrophe. But fighting the British counter-sniper teams was like being stalked by a tiger in tall grass. You knew something was there. You knew it was watching you, but you couldn't see it. Interviews conducted with German prisoners of war after D-Day revealed a fascinating mix of grudging admiration and deep, shaking paranoia regarding British marksmanship. One captured German officer famously noted the difference in survival rates. He said that on the Eastern Front, if you ran across a street under fire, you might get lucky. The volume of Soviet fire was high, but it was often inaccurate, sprayed by conscripts with submachine guns. You could gamble with your life and win. Against the British, however, the gamble was almost always fatal. The officer stated bluntly, "If you run against a Tommy, you die." This reputation created a suppression effect far greater than artillery. A single British sniper could pin down a German company not by firing 100 rounds, but by firing one and then waiting. The British counter-sniper teams utilized patience as their primary weapon. This was the aspect that broke the German nerve. In Russia, if a German sniper fired a shot, the Soviet response was predictable: an immediate, furious mortar barrage or a wave of rifle fire directed at the general area. It was noisy but confirmed that the enemy was panicked. The British response was often absolute, terrifying silence. This silence was a psychological torture device. The German sniper, hiding in a church bell tower or a thicket, would fire his shot and wait for the return fire. When none came, doubt would begin to creep in. Did they see me? He would wonder. Are they flanking me right now? Is a tank moving up? He would wait. 10 minutes would pass. Then 20. The battlefield would remain eerily quiet. Slowly, the German would convince himself he was safe, that his position was undiscovered. He would relax his muscles. He would slowly begin to withdraw or, fatal error, lift his head just an inch higher to take another shot. And that is when the British sniper would strike. The British were not ignoring him. They were studying him. They had spent those 20 minutes adjusting their scopes, calculating the windage, and waiting for him to make that one final mistake. This doctrine emphasized a one-shot, one-kill mentality far more strictly than the chaotic suppression tactics seen elsewhere in the war. To achieve this, the British sniper was equipped with the Enfield No. 4 MK. IT. This was the Rolls-Royce of sniper rifles in World War II, hand-picked for accuracy at the Holland & Holland factory, famous for making luxury hunting rifles. It was paired with the No. 32 telescopic sight. The No. 32 scope was originally designed for Bren machine gun, meaning it was incredibly rugged. It held its zero even after being banged around in a jeep or dragged through the mud. While German optics were precise but delicate, the British rig was a workhorse. It allowed the British sniper to hit a man-sized target at 600 yards with boring consistency. But it wasn't just a rifle, it was the mind games. The British were masters of deception, bringing a level of theatricality to the battlefield that the rigid German doctrine struggled to counter. The most famous of these tactics was the use of dummy heads. British teams would carry papier-mâché heads, painstakingly painted to look like a soldier, often topped with a real helmet. They would mount these puppets on sticks and slowly, cautiously raise them above a trench parapet, sometimes even angling them to look like a soldier peering through binoculars. To add to the realism, a second soldier might blow cigarette smoke through a rubber tube connected to the dummy's mouth. To a tense German sniper 400 yards away, it looked exactly like a careless British officer taking a smoke break. The German would take the bait. He would fire, putting a bullet cleanly through the papier-mâché forehead. The moment the shot rang out, the trap snapped shut, the dummy would be pulled down, and the British observer would instantly insert a rod to the fresh bullet hole. By checking the angle of the rod, they could trace the trajectory back to the exact window or bush the shot came from, triangulating the German's position from the muzzle flash. Seconds later, the real British sniper, who had been waiting for this exact moment, would send a .303 round into that position. For the German sniper, it was a humiliating and terrifying way to die. He wasn't just outgunned. He was tricked, outsmarted, and executed by an enemy who was playing a deeper, deadlier game. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine and the war in Europe drew to its bloody close in 1945, the reputation of the British sniper had solidified into something legendary. The Wehrmacht was crumbling, its armies retreating on all fronts. But the specific terror inspired by the Tommies in the Ghillie Suits remained potent until the final surrender. While history books and Hollywood movies often focus on the Eastern Front, rightfully remembering the Soviet snipers for their incredible bravery and the sheer industrial scale of their battles in the ruined factories of Stalingrad, the British snipers achieved something fundamentally different. They didn't just rack up kill counts. They achieved total psychological dominance. They denied the enemy the feeling of safety, not just in the heat of battle, but in the quiet sectors where soldiers were supposed to rest. The British sniper teams turned the entire concept of the sniper duel on its head. In the early years of the war, German marksmen viewed themselves as the apex predators of the battlefield. They were the elites, the Jaegers, the hunters. But in the hedgerows of France and the forests of Germany, these self-proclaimed predators found themselves becoming the prey. The German snipers, who had survived the frozen hell of Russia, found themselves outmatched in a deadly game of hide-and-seek against men who treated warfare with the patience of a gamekeeper culling a sick deer. This shift in power was absolute. German prisoners captured in the final months of the war often spoke of a ghost sickness. They described the feeling of being watched constantly. A German unit could be miles behind the front line, brewing coffee or fixing track on a panzer, and suddenly an officer would drop dead. No crack of a rifle, no second shot. Just one man down in silence. This forced the Germans to live in a state of perpetual crouching fear, eroding their morale long before the tanks actually rolled into view. The true terror of the British sniper wasn't about the volume of lead flying through the air. It was about the intelligence behind the trigger. It was a fear of facing a professional hunter who knew your tactics better than you did. The British sniper knew where you would hide. He knew which tree offered the best vantage point, and he knew that you would choose it. So, he wouldn't look at the tree. He would aim at the gap in the leaves where your head would eventually appear. This was the fear of a man willing to wait 3 days in the pouring rain, urinating in his suit, eating hardtack without moving his jaw, just to put a single .303 round through your helmet. The German soldier knew that while the American artillery might miss and the Soviet infantry might be suppressed, the British sniper simply would not shoot until you were already dead. In the final analysis, the German sniper's greatest fear wasn't the roar of the Sherman tank or the scream of the Typhoon rocket. Those were external threats you could see and run from. His greatest fear was the landscape itself. It was a silent, grassy knoll that didn't look quite right. It was the bush that seemed a little too dense. It was the shadow that didn't move with the sun. The legacy of the British sniper in World War II is a testament to the power of patience over brute force. They prove that in chaotic noise of modern war, the quietest soldier is often the deadliest. For the German veteran looking back, the war wasn't ended by a bang, but by the terrifying realization that by the time he noticed a mistake in the landscape, the bolt had already been thrown. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the psychological warfare of World War II, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to The Last Offensive for more untold stories from the front lines. We want to hear from you in the comments. Which sniper rifle do you think was a true king of the Second World War? Was it the precision engineering of the German Kar 98K, the rugged, mass-produced reliability of the Soviet Mosin-Nagant, or the smooth action and deadly accuracy of the British Enfield? Let the debate begin in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.